I guess because this is a virtual meeting, we will call the roll for each business item. As you know, we have a written chat function. Please only use that function to address technical difficulties, like if you can't hear. We should communicate with each other through speaking. This ensures that even people listening to the recording can hear all comments shared during the meeting. So if there's no questions on that, I will call this meeting to order, and we'll take attendance by roll call to ensure that we have a quorum. Michelle, please call the roll.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Here.
Chambliss.
Here.
Cummings.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Lee.
Here.
Lilligren.
Here.
Lindstrom. Mousse.
Here.
Vento.
Here.
Wolf.
Here.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And we have a quorum. And the first item on our agenda is approval of the agenda. And if committee members have no changes or comments, we can consider that approved without a roll call, and we can move on to our business. Committee members, any changes? Hearing none, we will move on to the approval of the minutes from the January 4th meeting and the January 13th special meeting. Is there a motion to approve the minutes, please?
Atlas Ingebrigtsen moves for approval.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Wolf
Vento
seconds.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf or Chambliss, thanks. And any discussion on the motion, additions or corrections to the minutes? Hearing none, Michelle, please call the roll.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom. Mousse.
Aye.
Vento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That item is adopted, and we have one item on the consent agenda. This is considered non-controversial, or it's a routine item that that is the City of St. Louis Park Historic Water Lake District Mixed-Use Comprehensive Plan. Is there a motion to approve, please?
Johnson moves.
Thank you. Is there a second?
Second by Lee.
Thank you, Councilmember Lee. Any discussion on the motion? Discussion? Hearing none, Michelle, please call the roll on that consent business item.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Mousse.
Aye.
Vento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. That item is adopted, and moving on to our non-consent business items. The first is item 2021-1. It's the Rice Creek North Regional Trail Master Plan Amendment. It's for Ramsey County, and that will be presented by Tracy Kinney. Ms. Kinney, welcome.
Thank you, Chair. Committee members, can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. Good afternoon. Hi, my name is Tracy Kinney. I'm a senior planner in the Community Development Division's Regional Parks Unit. And today the item before you is Ramsey County's Rice Creek North Regional Trail Master Plan. Next slide, please. The Rice Creek North Regional Trail is located in the northwest part of the regional park system and in Ramsey County. The figure to your left and in the middle of the slide are figures 1 and 2 of your business item. The Ramsey County section of trail is 4.75 miles of trail That extends from the Rice Creek chain of a 14-mile trail corridor that extends from the Rice Creek chain of lakes regional park in Anoka County all the way to the Long Lake Regional in Ramsey County. And in the image to your right, and this is also your business item. Next slide, please. The new master plan under consideration today guides the development and natural resources management of the trail and its corridor. The master plan is also proposing a significant boundary adjustment, increasing the trail corridor acreage from 792 acres to 2,400 acres. This boundary adjustment will not be considered as part of this request since it exceeds the minor boundary adjustment criteria in Chapter 5, Strategy 1 of the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan. Ramsey County should request the proposed boundary adjustment during the next Regional Parks Policy Plan update as part of a systems additions process currently estimated for 2024. The proposed acquisitions are publicly held properties, and these are listed to the left of you on this slide, and then also in the yellow areas in the image to the right. And then this image is also figure 4 of your business item. The next slide, please. So here's the development concept for the regional trail. The proposed improvements include enhanced trailheads, additional internal trails, improved water trail facilities, and unified features. Of note is a multi-season trailhead destination using an existing structure named Building 189. The master plan is also proposing more multi-use and cross-country ski trails and new off-road cycling and hiking trails, as well as improved canoeing and kayaking facilities. The public was involved in the development of this master plan through 2 engagement processes conducted in 2018 and 2019. Ramsey County conducted an equity analysis as part of this master plan that adds improvements to future engagement awareness efforts, such as translation services. Next slide, please. The total cost to implement this master plan, not including the proposed expansion, is $38 million for development and $233,000 for 3 years of natural resource management and $467,000 annually for operations. No council funding is associated with this approval of this master plan at this time. Upon approval of the master plan and subject to further systems additions of process approvals, the county may apply for funding available for use of funding through available funding sources, subject to their applicable terms and processes to implement the eligible projects identified through the master plan. Next slide, please. The rationale for the proposed action is that the proposed boundary adjustment will not be considered as part of this request since it exceeds the minor boundary adjustment criteria in Chapter 5, Strategy 1 of the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan. Otherwise, the Rice Creek North Regional Trail Master Plan is consistent with the requirements of the 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan, particularly Planning Policy Strategy 1, and other council policies. And this is in reference to Thrive 2040. Next slide, please. So the proposed action before you today is that the Metropolitan Council approve the Ramsey County Rice Creek North Regional Trail Master Plan without the proposed boundary adjustment and proposed acquisitions. And then to advise Ramsey County that the proposed boundary adjustment and associated 2,407.24 acre acquisition should be submitted to the Metropolitan Council as a systems addition request in the next Regional Parks Policy Plan update. currently estimated for 2024, and to require that Ramsey County, prior to initiating any new development of the regional trail corridor, to send preliminary plans to the Environmental Services Assistant Manager at the Metropolitan Council's Environmental Services Division, and finally to advise the county to implement the advisory comments regarding transportation as described in this report. The Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission unanimously recommended approval of this request at its January 7th meeting. Next slide, please. And with that, I'll stand for any questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Kinney, for your report and for your work on this. Any questions for Ms. Kinney on this report? Any questions or discussion? If not, Ms. Kinney has proposed a series of actions to approve the Ramsey County Rice Creek North Regional Trail Master Plan, and I would entertain a motion to approve, please.
So moved by Lee.
Chair, this is Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen. I move for approval.
Well, Councilmember
Second
Lee
by
beat you to the punch, but I will take yours as Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen as a second. So we have the motion properly before us. Is there any discussion?
Chair, if I could, this is Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Yeah, please, Councilmember.
I just wanted to let the community or the committee and community know that this proposal did come from before the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, and robust conversation received unanimous support.
Thank you, Councilmember. I appreciate that. I appreciate your work on behalf of the council at MPOS. Any further discussion on the motion? Discussion. Councilmember Muse, did you want to say something? I see that you went off mute.
No.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you. Okay, thank you. Seeing no further discussion, Michelle, please call the roll on the motion.
Yes, Chair. Atlas Ingebrigtsen,
Aye.
Chambliss,
Aye.
Cummings,
Aye.
Johnson,
Aye.
Lee,
Aye.
Lilligren,
Aye.
Mousse,
Aye.
Bento,
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That motion is adopted, and we will move on to our next non-consent item, which is item 2021-2. It's the Regional Park System Competitive Equity Grant Program, the 2021 Notice of Funding Availability. And Jessica Lee is here to present. Welcome, Ms. Lee.
Good afternoon, Chair and Council members. This is Jessica Lee. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Great. So I'm presenting the business item 2021-2, Regional Park System Competitive Equity Grant Program, 2021 Notice of Funding Availability. Next slide, please. The 2040 Regional Parks Policy Plan commits the Council to develop a competitive equity grant program to strengthen equitable use of the regional park system and to enhance institutional capacity around equity work. In 2019, the Council established a pilot program that resulted in 3 equity projects: Dakota Homeland Interpretation along the Minnesota River Greenway Regional Trail, the Bede-Makaska Cloudman Memorial, and elements of the Wakan Teepee Center at Bruce Vento Nature Sanctuary. The pilot program was very competitive and illustrated the need for additional funding, especially for non-capital funding. The Council responded by authorizing $1.4 million in parks interest earnings for the 2021 Equity Grant Program. These funds may be used to fund operating costs, including programming and staff. Next slide, please. So the 2021 Notice of Funding Availability, or NOFA, which is attached to the business item, was developed with input from the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, the Community Development Committee, the Equity Advisory Committee, and Regional Park Implementing Agency directors, planners, and outreach staff. The 2021 NOFA emphasizes partnership building, equity programming efforts, internal and interagency collaboration, and innovative accessibility projects to provide meaningful, rich experiences for users. Next slide, please. One more slide, please. Thank you. So this year we have just over $2 million available for the Equity Grant Program. $664,000 is available for capital projects, and $1.4 million is available from Parks interest earnings, which the Council has prioritized using for non-capital programming projects. Next slide, please. The Equity Grant Program is only available for the 10 regional park implementing agencies. Partnerships are strongly encouraged, but grant agreements must be with an implementing agency. Agencies must have or be working towards an ADA self-evaluation or transition plan. Agencies with plans that are more than 10 years old are encouraged to apply for $20,000 grant through the Equity Grant Program to update their plans. Next slide, please. This year, proposals must clearly articulate how the project will advance equitable use of the regional park system by addressing one or more of the following equity focus areas: race, ethnicity, income, ability, age, or national origin. Next slide, please. Here are some examples of possible projects. Collaborative efforts among multiple agencies are encouraged. This could be a system-wide marketing plan, system-wide signage, or a shared bike fleet or mobile classroom. Partnerships between an agency and the community are also encouraged. Agencies could propose to contract with a community organization or individual to identify or develop a capital project or equity programming. New equity programming efforts around outreach, education, marketing, communications, special events, translation and interpretation services, staff training, and hiring staff to develop new programs are all possible projects. And innovative capital projects that will advance accessibility beyond minimum requirements are strongly encouraged. Next slide, please. So again, we have $664,000 for capital projects. Agencies may apply for multiple capital projects, but may only receive up to $200,000 in capital funds. $1.4 million is available in Parks interest earnings. The Council prioritizes using these interest earnings for non-capital projects. Agencies may apply for multiple non-capital projects, but may only receive up to $200,000 in interest earnings funds. Non-capital projects will be reviewed first and recommended for funding. If funds remain, the review committee may recommend using them for capital projects. Individual grants can range from $20,000 to $200,000. Next slide, please. We've received a lot of input from commissioners and council members and suggest the following guidelines to the agencies. We encourage innovative ADA capital projects that are built on established partnerships and provide a meaningful, rich experience for users with disabilities not limited to physical. We encourage agencies to submit project ideas for non-capital equity programming and to collaborate internally across agency staff. Both large and small projects are encouraged. A strong value is placed on partnerships and ideas coming from partners or the community to inform projects. We encourage projects that build new partnerships and demonstrate how partnerships will grow or be maintained after the grant period. And collaboration across agencies is encouraged. Next slide, please. Council staff will begin the review process by ensuring applications are complete and eligible. Then a review team will score the proposals and make recommendations for funding to the Council. The review team will be comprised of members from the Metropolitan Parks and Open Space Commission, the Community Development Committee, the Equity Advisory Committee, and implementing agency representatives. Members will recuse themselves from scoring or commenting on any applications for which they have a real or perceived conflict of interest. Next slide, please. The evaluation and scoring criteria prioritize programming, partnership building, and internal collaboration with outreach staff. The 5 review categories are impact on equitable use, community partnerships, community engagement, capacity building, and programming initiatives. Next slide, please. Our hope is that the NOFA will be approved by the Council later this month, which would then allow for the application to open by February 1st. Agencies will have 6 weeks to apply. Then the review process should be completed by April or May, and funding recommendations will hopefully be brought to the Council by June. Next slide, please. A recommended action for your consideration is that the Metropolitan Council authorize the Regional Park System Competitive Equity Grant Program 2021 Notice of Funding Availability. And with that, I'm happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lee, for your work on this and for the report. And I'm sure there will be questions and discussion. And before we enter that, I just want to remind committee members, guests, and staff that today at 4:30 our time, there will be a ceremony in our nation's capital to honor the victims of COVID-19. And so I don't know that won't stop business or anything, but just to remind folks, and if you want to maybe make an honoring in your own heart or in your own way at that time. Yeah, thanks. Discussion on this report, questions or discussion? Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. I just wanted to thank the work of the staff and previous councils, council members, and our own council. I think many of you, if you recall back to our very first year when we started talking about what needed to happen in our parks at a regional level, one of the things many people talked about was the need for programming. If we all think back to our experience in what got us engaged in the outdoors or maybe prevented us from being in the outdoors is not having someone who brought you in and connected you to an activity or learning or an appreciation for the outdoors. So we often talk about the need for programming is the way that we connect people to the outdoors. It's not in a sidewalk that often does it. There are many barriers that keep people from connecting. However, much of the funding that is available to our regional park agencies is used for maintenance, conservation, or capital projects, building projects. And we haven't had a dedicated funding source that really pushed us to innovate in the area of programming. So this is an example of a lot of our conversations and what our previous council to us wanted to see come to life, but did not have the revenue opportunity available to them to do so. And we've been able to do that. So one, I think it is a major step forward for us. Of course, this is with full support, raving support of MPOSC. For them, one of the MPOSC members said, 6 years in the making, getting to the point of having dedicated funds around advancing equity in outreach and engagement and programming in our parks. And so I just want to earmark this occasion, I guess, and highlight what this means for us and for our regional partners. I have a question, but I wanted to just pause there in the event anyone had any questions related to what I just shared.
Thank you, Councilmember. We'll come back to you. Any questions from council members on what Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen just shared? Questions? Seeing none, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you. So one of the things we have gotten around of some interests for different projects, and one question I have for staff is, what would happen if we got projects for the equity grant, but they, let's say they don't address one area of inequity or historic inequity in our parks. Let's say they only serve a specific age group, or they fail to address at all racial disparities. What would we do in that case? How would we avoid having a situation where that happens?
Ms. Lee, is that a question that you can answer?
Thank you, Chair. I will attempt to answer the question. I believe the way it's set up is our NOFA allows for any one of the target areas listed in Thrive. However, ultimately it'll be up to the review committee who is scoring the projects and recommending projects for funding to determine what their priorities will be. And last year, as you might recall from the pilot program, projects that targeted multiple equity focus groups definitely scored higher and were recommended for funding.
Could I ask a follow-up question?
Please.
Miss Lee, could you envision a time where we have a full group of equity grants come forward and none of them address racial inequities or access?
Chair, members, I'm hesitant to say yes or no, but I have a hard time picturing that happening.
Thank you. That was somewhat of a hypothetical. I wonder about how do we prepare. I think it's a lot to put on the scoring group. I was a part of that last year and we were dealing with that a little bit. I would like to see our implementing agencies be successful and to not surprise them with anything in that, let's say they come forward and they think it's okay to submit all projects with just one audience in mind, and then they get frustrated. So I just want to make sure that we're communicating clearly about that expectation and also serving as a resource ahead of time so they're not caught off guard, and that the group put together to do the voting isn't put in a tricky position either. I hope that makes sense. I don't know that that was the most articulate. Maybe somebody can help me with that. Thank you.
No,
Mr. Chair?
I think it was clear.
Oh.
Yep, Councilmember Johnson.
Yeah, I mean, I really appreciate that question because it might just be great intentions and submit something. And then to your point, Councilmember Atlas-Ingebrigtsen, you kind of get yourself into a weird position if you're on the scoring committee. Maybe it could just follow, I'm offering just a suggestion, where even with our comp plans, when things come into us, but they're incomplete or not quite as we need them to be, staff just advises the applicant that it hasn't met the criteria yet, and give it back with maybe some suggestions or guidelines, and remind them of the criteria. And that way it's not even in the pile for consideration. Maybe that's the first level that needs to, be met, is that with staff's kind of quick review.
Thanks, Councilmember. Ms. Lee, any comment on that or on that suggestion?
Yeah, and I think that's a good suggestion, Chair. And if I could just follow up, I will mention that we've met with a couple agencies one-on-one to discuss the program, and we have been giving the guidance that the more equity groups you can target, the better it'll be, and so that we're not. I know we have high expectations for these projects, and we're willing to meet with all the agencies one-on-one, of course, and we're also going to be presenting to our partners meeting to give them additional guidance and just really encourage them to look at ways to develop the projects with multiple equity focus areas in mind. So, thank you.
Thank you. Further discussion on this report?
Robert, your mic's in the wrong spot again.
Oh, sorry about that. Sorry. Thanks. Further discussion on the report. I really want to just lift up what Councilmember Atlas-Ingebrigtsen said and commend you, Ms. Lee, and the other park staff on really listening to what the council was saying. I think this is just really a good example of how our conversations then can be distilled by staff into sort of actionable items. And so I look forward to seeing what these programming dollars yield in project applications. So if there are no further questions or discussions on the report, Ms. Lee has recommended an action that the Metropolitan Council authorize the Regional Park System Competitive Equity Grant Program 2021 Notice of Funding Availability, and I would entertain a motion to approve, please.
Chambliss makes a motion to approve.
Thank you.
Atlas-Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Councilmember. Discussion on the motion? Discussion. Hearing. Oh, did someone have something to say? Okay. Hearing no discussion, Michelle, please call the roll.
Yes, Chair Lilligren. Atlas-Ingebrigtsen.
Aye.
Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Musse.
Aye.
Vento.
Aye.
Wolf.
Aye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. That item is adopted, and we will move on to our information item for the evening. That's the 2021 Livable Communities Act program criteria discussion. This is some work that's been going on in the housing work group, and it's been really incredibly interesting. And this will be presented by Tara Beard. Ms. Beard, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good evening, members of the committee. As introduced, I am Tara Beard. I manage the Livable Communities unit in the Community Development Division. And I know folks are pretty familiar with me at this point, as we've been having a lot of conversations lately about the LCA criteria. Next slide, please. So today is the third in 3 conversations before coming before you to recommend approval of scoring and other program criteria for the 2021 round of LCA programs. Today specifically, we're going to check in on that timeline. That is always good to ground ourselves with. And then return to some equity-specific scoring criteria that I brought before you at our last conversation on December 21st, and just raise a couple more points for discussion and offer a little bit more opportunity to kind of process and discuss that criteria. Also going to address changes to the blue line extension that you are probably familiar with, but may or may not want to impact the eligibility areas for the LCDA TOD, the Transit Oriented Development Grant Program, which is only available to areas close to a station area planned or existing high use station area in our transit system. And then finally, cover some funding availability and other program schedule specifics that will also need to be included in the adoption on February, or in the recommendation, I should say, on February 1st. So hopefully we'll have this conversation today. I'll be able to tie up any loose ends or questions or changes that we discussed today and bring forward recommended program and funding criteria on the first for the committee to consider forwarding on to the council. Next slide. So here we have that timeline for our discussions. You've been there along the way, starting in November with higher level criteria. In December, we dug in a little bit deeper. Today, we're going to tie up some of the loose ends from those conversations, as well as talk about funding and other specific program criteria coming to you again on February 1st, and hopefully being approved by the council on February 10th. Next slide. So let's jump into the equity-specific scoring criteria that I mentioned we had discussed and I had presented on December 21st, but just wanted to flesh out a little bit more some of the context and create an opportunity for a little bit more discussion. Specifically, just a little bit more time looking at proposed scoring for racial equity, but also looking at that in the context of broader equity, recognizing that there are portions of the scoring criteria that are specific to racial equity, but that there are also criteria that can include racial equity, but also address broader equity. So making sure that's clear to you all where those factors are scored in, and that that's something you are all comfortable with in our evaluation. Then I want to revisit some equity criteria that considers community context presented on the 21st, and make sure folks feel comfortable with it and understand it, and how it can impact project evaluation. And then finally, we introduced on the 21st the idea of a minimum bar for equity efforts and projects. So of equity-derived points, do we want to set a minimum bar, a minimum share of those points that projects have to meet to be able to move ahead and be considered for funding? And so, again, I want to provide a little more context and information for conversation and make sure folks are comfortable with that and can give me direction for what to bring forward to you on February 1st. Next slide, please. So getting to racial equity versus broader equity, and versus is a horrible way to juxtapose those two, so I apologize. But want to take a moment to reflect on where criteria supports equity broadly in the proposed scoring criteria and where it addresses racial equity specifically, because it is intentional and there's thought behind where it is specified and not. And so I want to make sure folks feel comfortable with that and can ask questions about that. Both are very important, obviously, to consider in the criteria, and yet some equity criteria does specifically call out racial equity, where criteria speaks to the unique impact of historic racist policies and practices that continue to influence disparities in development patterns we see, like housing choice, access to jobs, and the influence and agency that often BIPOC residents do not have, even in areas where the majority of residents are people of color. And so that specific racial equity criteria can be found in the What Project Outcomes section, where evaluation is specifically considering how the project is or is not contributing to the same development patterns and outcomes that we see today that reflect those racist policies and practices in our development patterns. For example, this would be things like projects that accept housing choice vouchers being something that would, articulate a project that is addressing to some extent housing choice through a racial equity lens. Or projects coming from project teams with disadvantaged business enterprise policies and practices. That gets at equity, racial equity specific to access to jobs. And so that's where some of the racial equity criteria lives in kind of what it's trying to capture. The other criteria in the proposed criteria that specifies racial equity can be found in the how section, the project process section. And I'm gonna dig into that a little bit more. So I'm gonna just pause on that for now and say we'll visit that more deeply in a coming slide. But now I want to take a moment to talk about the equity criteria that considers broader equity impacts, and that also can be found in the what section, the project outcomes section, just in different criteria. So where consideration of how a project is addressing the needs of any type of population not currently served in the area or by the private market. That's a specific criterion we'd be looking at, a lens we'd be looking at the project through that could include all sorts of different either protected groups or other marginalized groups. This could refer to projects serving folks with disabilities, low-income artists, seniors, any kind of disadvantaged group. But staff also realized that there is other criteria in the project outcomes section that was presented on the 21st that actually could be emboldened a little bit more, could be strengthened with a broader equity lens. And I just want to call out and express my appreciation to Councilmember Wolf for meeting with me to discuss this over the last few weeks. She really provided some very helpful feedback that led to some of these recommendations. So specifically, some of the criteria presented on December 21st that gets at mobility, movement, transportation, and that sort of pedestrian bike experience, the experience in and around a site of a project we could fund. That criteria upon second look could do more to include accessibility and equitable access, especially around abilities and folks with different types of abilities. So Greg, if you'll go to the next slide. I'm showing the proposed criteria from December 21st that speaks to design-led strategies that support or expand bicycle, pedestrian, and other micromobility infrastructure, especially those that contribute to larger existing plan networks, and just suggesting that we add in there a specific call out to accessibility features, and that be something that is a part of the consideration and evaluation of the points in that criteria. And then the next one, and then I'll pause for conversation. Next slide, please. Sorry, thank you, is more about that kind of human experience and human scale design, placemaking, if you will. And that criteria as proposed on the 21st was to create a welcoming public realm and access to green space that facilitates social interactions and increases community connections within and around the site via location, programming, or design. And again, we're proposing to add the consideration of accessibility in that design and in that experience to achieve full points for that criterion. So I'll stop here and see if there's any questions or reactions to these proposed changes and the conversation in general about calling out racial equity and criteria that addresses equity broadly.
Thank you, Ms. Beard. Questions, comments, observations?
Councilmember Chambliss.
Please, Councilmember. I can't see you all, so please just speak up. Councilmember Chambliss.
Okay, thank you for the introduction, Tara, and your work on these proposed changes, and Councilmember Wolf for following up and looking at consideration of accessibility to enhance this. I think it's really important when we have this opportunity to impact policy that, we've gone through all of the steps in terms of engaging our constituents and community organizations and reviewing, the source, our statutory goals. with regard to the racial equity goals, I think it's really important that not only do we do the who and the what, but we focus on follow-up to ensure that we have quality as we move forward with these changes. You know, evaluation is really important for improvement. It impacts accountability going forward, and it also provides an opportunity for learning. And with that evaluation, I think it's really important to have measurable goals, which I know that is part of the reason why we updated the criteria so that the goals that we have are measurable. And in order to do that, we need to be capturing racially disaggregated data, which I know the organization is in the process of figuring out a better way to do that. And that would also be a part of the evaluation follow-up, and also it should be a part of the assessment of the applications. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. I am struggling a little bit with how we're talking about equity consistently across our work, and in this area in particular. And one of the things, and I don't know if it's because of the example that was used but it's something that I've seen happen throughout our work. And I don't want to downplay the importance of engagement or input, but engagement and input do not equal a redress of systemic inequity. And so on our website, we define equity as recognizing institutional and systematic barriers and creating access and opportunities. And so I think this is getting a little bit towards what maybe Councilmember Chambliss's comments are, but what that speaks to is clear, measurable understanding of the barriers and clear, measurable understanding of the metric we're looking for when success is accomplished, right? And so what I don't want us to continue to conflate is the relationship between input and engagement and an output of increased equity. And I think it's such a challenge for many, but because we use the word equity, implying that we have it. But really what we're saying is we are working to address historic inequities. That's what we're actually doing. Our hope is that we increase equity as a result of it, but we really are looking to solve for those issues. So I don't think that this conversation can happen all today in this time frame. So I'm happy to have conversations outside of this time to continue and to be a thought partner in this. But I think for me, we need to get to those really clear metrics that we are identifying, that we can make sure our communities can understand without question, that we're talking about right now. And maybe we can't get at every single historical inequity as it relates to community development there is, but we certainly should be able to get to the ones that we feel are to be prioritized, or that we feel we have the ability to affect the most significantly right now. So maybe that's an invitation to conversation or something more. If I missed something, I'm happy. Please.
Thank you, Councilmember. Ms. Beer, did you want to comment at this point, or just want us to go on with more dialogue?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Council members, I really value and appreciate so much your thoughts. There's a lot of great thought there to talk about, and a lot I want to share about kind of our evaluation goals for the future. One of the things I hear you saying that I know speaks to a goal I have is exactly to your point, is sort of like So what does equity look like? What are the, if we're saying we want to further equity, do we know what that looks like? Because we would need to have that vision in our mind to work backward to how to prioritize projects that do those things. And so I think that I take your comments to heart. I want to always continue the conversation. I do want to ask if there's anything specific about this criteria that you would like me to look into or consider changing before February, before our next conversation. If it would be great to have clarity if this is an invitation to an ongoing conversation or a direct request that I make or look into some change before our next meeting. That would be really helpful.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I'm happy to talk further. It is something that I don't want to see this can kick down the road any longer. When we started 2 years ago, the response was, well, we need to define equity. And the thing is that inequities are not something for us to define. They're well documented. So the question is a matter of us picking what are the metrics and measures we're going to follow that we think is going to get us the best result on addressing those inequities. And so what I would say is that, whatever you need from me, and I would go out on a limb to say several of our colleagues on this committee would be willing to as well do what we need to get that to happen sooner rather than later. But I think that that's really an important thing and this, Ms. Baird, I want to make sure this is not a message to you uniquely. I hope that this is coming through clear, and I hope that, I encourage my council colleagues to pipe in if they agree. This is a message to everybody. We have to stop saying we need to define what equity means and what inequity means. We have folks here who are some of the smartest in the country doing this work. I 100% believe there's tons of research out there about how historic inequities persist in housing, in transportation, and investment. I know I work in that part of that field myself. So I guess I just want to, what do we need to do? What power do you need? What wind in your sails do you require for us to utilize that knowledge we have? Where's the roadblock? That's kind of how I'm feeling. So yes, I'm happy to do whatever's needed before February so that we get to a place where we have really clear metrics in this. I'd love to hear from some of my colleagues if they feel the same way.
Great. Thanks, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen, and I appreciate your willingness to follow up. I think a follow-up conversation would be hugely helpful, and I see that Councilmember Johnson is requesting the floor. Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I fully support what Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen says. And, I've been working with Tara and other council members and the team on this. And, I'll just restate what I've been saying, but I think it's in support of what you were saying, Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen. As we move away from transaction into transformation, I want to be very clear about what we expect in the outcomes and define that as clearly as possible, because eating at the edges isn't going to get us where we need to go. So that's why I'm trying to understand how our systems even integrate and work together. And I know Tara's been working on that too, because housing relies on transportation, and transportation, and jobs are dependent, and education, and, generational wealth building. It all builds together. So I think, if we score a project and a project gets built, we should then also be able to, again, layer over, what's happening with the improvements and measures that we are seeking to get to our goals. And I know that's not easy, but I would, I rely on others in this space to help me understand, but I do know that there are experts out there that could probably come alongside us, and we have experts on the council too, but come alongside us to help inform what more specifically we need to be doing, to Councilmember Atlas Ingebrigtsen's point, and really arming, that might not be the word I want to use, empowering, resourcing the committee so that they can really see clearly those projects that will utilize our dollars to the greatest extent possible for our outcomes. The only other thing I would add, let me just back it up too. I do also appreciate, I'm looking at the PowerPoint, I've got it up here myself, but to the point too of project progress criteria focus on racially responsive community engagement and input in the context of communities with different demographics. That's a lot of words, and I understand where we're trying to go, but I think the specificity and I think further, I think just the comments Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson helps me to better understand that we don't want to do, and I don't think we're intending to do more of what we've been doing, but how do we really get to what we need to get to equity? So I'm just supporting those comments, Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson. The other thing I just want to jump back to was thanking Councilmember Wolf for her engagement on this regarding disability and accessibility. And again, this is not my primary space, whatsoever, but is there, I love the language that was added. That is awesome. But is there a time when we'd start using universal design elements? Because that to me is the, ultimate leveling of the playing field from what I'm learning. Everybody can use it. So if it, visual, physical, cognitive, I don't know, all the different ways people are enabled. I don't know if that means something different than accessibility. I just throw that out there as I was reading in preparation for tonight.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'm still trying to follow where Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson is going. I'm not sure that I fully understand. Some of the concerns that I raised were for things like, say you have a community that doesn't have much in the way of senior housing, and they want a senior housing building so that their seniors can move out of their affordable single family homes and open them up for families. To me, that's something that we should support because it helps bring affordable single family homes into the market for families. You can't define what race the people who are going into the senior housing is going to be. You can't define what race the people who would have the access to the resulting single family homes would be. But I've seen it in places work to bring new families that would not have otherwise have had access into the community have access. And yeah, a lot of them do end up being families of color, but it should be anybody who is at the lower end of the income spectrum. Not, the area where I live was built after all of the laws were passed to outlaw discrimination in housing. And in fact, when my neighbor 2 doors down sold his house this winter, a couple months ago, he wasn't even allowed to know what the races or demographics or characteristics, anything about the people who were making offers on his home. He had no idea. All he knew was the dollar amount and what they wanted for their offer, so that there could be no discrimination on who was going into the home. So the whole thing with the racial covenants and everything doesn't necessarily travel out to all of the rest of the metro in terms of historic discrimination, in the same way that you would have, like in North Minneapolis, with the city putting all of the affordable housing in North Minneapolis, where Dakota County has been intentionally spreading theirs out throughout the county for the last 30 years.
Thank you. And I see Councilmember Chambliss is requesting the floor. And also, I think, Councilmember Wolf, you were sort of asking for more clarification from Councilmember Atlas Ingebretson, right?
Yes,
but I think,
yes.
if you don't mind, I'll recognize Councilmember Chambliss first and then come back to you, Linnea. Councilmember Chambliss.
The question that Wendy was asking about, housing and you can't identify the person's race. I think that's a separate discussion. What we're talking about is our goal as a council. We've already identified that we support racial equity. We have our ways of identifying our strategies and creating strategies to accomplish that. So, the conversations about what it means can happen. We've had committee of the whole meetings for that, and I think that's the appropriate place to continue that discussion so we can have that continued dialogue and have the learning that I was talking about before when we talk about evaluation. So our strategies are what in our statutes, and our goals are what we use to resolve systemic racism in our system. And so I'd like to focus on that for today and the criteria. And the ask was, what do we think so far about racial equity and broader equity, the what and the how, and the proposed changes. And I, for one, am okay with those proposed changes. And then I'll defer the answer back to the chair for Linnea.
Thank you. Councilmember Atlas-Ingerbritsen.
Chair, thank you. I think Councilmember Chambliss did a great job of articulating the right level of the conversation we're talking about is system-wide. And I guess maybe what Councilmember Wolf was getting to is that maybe in some communities they don't deal with these kind of historic disparities. However, I would argue that there are rural, ex-urban, suburban, and urban communities that have dealt with historic disparities, and that's really what we're talking about. We have this, and if you aren't looking regularly at our own websites, visualizing disparities, then please familiarize yourself with that. We don't have everybody feeling the impacts of employment disparities and housing disparities at the same rates. That's the whole point. It's not happening that way. It is happening across racial lines. We didn't have the governor come visit with us last month, but a big part of that was because 50% of African Americans lost their jobs due to COVID. That didn't happen to everybody. That happened to African Americans in our state. And so that is what I just want to be clear. And Councilmember Chambliss said that that's what we're talking about. So we're talking about at that high level, and there's plenty of research, plenty of knowledge, plenty of experts in our organization, outside our organization, and many of the organizations that several of us work for that we can leverage and use to clearly define this. So I just, so I agree that that's a conversation. If there's confusion around us addressing disparities, which are based on race in our region, mostly, then that conversation should be happening at our committee of the whole or council whole or in our equity learning that we're all participating in. And this is a separate issue. I'd agree with that perspective. So, and Tara, I just invite conversation. You let me know what and how and when. I'm at your disposal.
Thank you. Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to clarify that you're saying that the council has decided that racial equity is a part of equity that we are only going to deal with livable communities, and that the other aspects of equity, such as being low income or disabled or elderly, are not on the table?
It is
So
an effort, part of our, sorry, Chair.
So I see both Councilmember Atlas-Ingerbritsen and Chambliss looking to respond. So Councilmember Chambliss, maybe I'll start there.
Yeah, my answer to that is no. That was never said in this conversation. We are looking, if we look at the criteria, the project outcome criteria focuses on racial equity impacts of proposed project. We've talked about why that is. We know how wide those disparities are. It does not mean that we are not looking at other criteria that is needed for our communities.
Thank you, Councilmember. And that's my understanding as well. And I think I really want to thank you, Councilmember Wolf, for lifting up the accessibility issues I'm really supportive of the language change there as well. And so do we need more clarifying here, council members, or are we ready to move on? I will note we have about 45 minutes left before we have to end this meeting. And I know that Ms. Wolf is looking for more input. And my thanks, Councilmember Atlas-Ingerbritsen, for your willingness to meet one-on-one. Further discussion, or okay, I see Councilmember Wolf, then Councilmember Chambliss.
And maybe the answer is that I talked offline with Councilmember Chambliss and Councilmember Atlas-Ingerbritsen, but half of the people who are in poverty are white, because we have so many white people. Even though it's a smaller percentage of the population, half of the people that we have in poverty are white. And I don't want to put all of our scoring on LCDA on just racial equity. I think that leaves out some other parts. If you had a project that is 100% for disabled people, but they don't do anything specifically for racial equity, they would not be eligible for any funding under Livable Communities. That's just one example under what is proposed for the scoring structure.
And Councilmember Chambliss.
Yeah, on page 4, equity-specific scoring criteria of the presentation, the first bullet, scoring for racial equity and broader criteria. And an example was given about the proposed criteria change to be broadened and expanded, supporting pedestrian, bicycle, and other micromobility infrastructure, et cetera, that we've just gone through. And it was also expanded to include accessibility features. So there's, throughout this presentation, it's talking about all forms of equity.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion here?
This is Councilmember Muse. With my respect to all, great conversations here. Let's just, it's not secret that we have one of the worst disparity in the nation when it comes to the people of color and whites. And here in Minnesota, if we want to really be serious about this, we have to call it what it is, and we have to really systematically be brave and address this issue. I support, eliminating all inequities, but here we do know in Minnesota, we have one of the worst racial disparity and economic disparity in the nation.
Thank you, Councilmember Muse. Further discussion, Councilmember Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think at any level of conversation, we have to really reckon with our history as a nation, and a lot of the historical structures have been oppressive towards people of color. When the GI Bill came about, it was supposed to be meant for all returning GIs post-war to buy a house. But we know that a lot of, as it was executed at the local level, between local mayors and realtors and real estate corporations and property owners, it mainly benefited white GIs, not black and brown GIs. And that single fact, that single transaction of buying a house, owning a house, and giving it down to your descendants as a wealth building vehicle is a single, one of the most single powerful acts of financial wealth building and legacy that you could pass on. It wasn't white businesses that were firebombed out of Tulsa, Oklahoma to be forced to move to Chicago. It was black businesses. And when we look at the historical issues and structures that have prevented a lot of black and brown folks from economic advance, it has been systems that were built to do what they do. And we are reckoning with it right now as a nation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion here? Further discussion. Thanks, Councilmember Atlas-Ingerbritsen, for being here. I understand that you have to leave out early, so good luck with your later meeting, and we'll turn back to you, Ms. Beard. And just note that we have about 40 minutes left in this space.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate that. And I appreciated that discussion. You sound a lot like the many staff meetings and outreach meetings we've had discussing these issues, and they're not easy and they're never really done. So just a reminder that we definitely view equity criteria as something that needs to be continually evaluated, as something that we continue to improve on. I'll share that our intent, and in terms of the scoring criteria I'm presenting to you today, the intent is to call out specifically when equitable criteria is addressing racial inequities, because they are unique and different, and also create space and opportunity to prioritize projects that are addressing other types of equity more broadly. So I can say that's the intention, and really looking for that kind of policy direction confirmation. I also want to state that we very much are trying to address racial equity in the outcomes of the project, not simply in the process. A lot of the points for equity live in the criteria for project outcomes, but there is certainly an important aspect of community input and engagement and how development projects are derived and what need they're meeting that absolutely have a role in our systemic inequities in terms of access and voice and power. And so Greg is showing the first slide in our conversation around racial equity criteria evaluation that is specific to process and outreach. And the work we did this year was to really get at feedback we received from a lot of communities that felt like often outreach criteria specifically, when it prioritized outreach for folks of color or BIPOC communities or communities often underrepresented, made a lot of communities broader out in the region that do not have a lot of racial diversity feel like they were not sure how they could compete or add points or address equity. And so we spent a lot of time in the housing work group, in meetings with metro cities and participants and amongst ourselves, kind of talking about how do we create opportunities for projects to score well because they are either inclusive of and listening to and responsive to and centering on folks underrepresented and folks often most impacted but least powerful in a project process, when there are a lot of residents that are in that group. And how do we create an opportunity for communities that don't have a lot of residents that are possibly low income, possibly also residents of color, and give them an opportunity to address equity by increasing access to that community for folks that might choose and want to live there but currently don't have that agency. And so that's where this particular set of criterion came out of those conversations, and basically looking at scoring criteria for this project process, this engagement piece, as a spectrum. And that we can help communities identify the demographics of their community, and depending on how diverse or how not diverse their community is, look for projects that are either really centering community in the definition of the project need and what the project's going to, and the access the project is going to create to historically marginalized communities, and also provide technical assistance and expertise to help communities that aren't particularly diverse to try and find their residents and community members that maybe aren't showing up at public meetings, but do in fact live in these communities, and or go above and beyond minimum kind of outreach and marketing requirements that are required by law, and make sure that folks that don't already live in that community do know of this new opportunity to access jobs or housing. It also is going to look at whether or not communities that are not terribly diverse are doing more than just within one project, because we know, right, that one development can't make an inclusive community. So another way that a community or an applicant could score points would be, what other efforts are you making as a fairly homogenous community to be more diverse, to be more inclusive, to be a place where folks of all different kind of backgrounds and races can feel comfortable. And so that's the intent behind this criteria, and it is centered in the engagement kind of conversation, but is certainly not the only place where racial equity criteria is. So I'll stop there and see if there's any feedback on that. This is the same slide as I showed you on the 21st, but I just felt like we didn't get enough time to kind of get into it.
Thanks, Ms. Beard. Discussion on that, and please just speak up. I can't see all of it.
Councilmember Chambliss, no feedback. I think that was a good recap.
Thank you. Other council members? Council members. All right, hearing none. Ms. Beard.
Wonderful. So then the next slide is actually lives in our section of the criteria that's about the project team and the makeup of the project team. And this is a hybrid criteria in the sense that for racially diverse communities, then we are looking for a racial equity lens in terms of who is on the project team and is at least one of the project partners racially representative of those least impacted and least represented and most impacted in the project area in that community. For racially homogenous communities, though, there is a broader equity lens we can use at awarding points in this criteria, and that's saying, you know, if there is a particular any kind of underrepresented community, so that could be seniors, that could be folks with different abilities. Is there a project partner that's representative of any of those particular communities that may be underrepresented, that could be that should be a part of and have a say in the project, given who it is purporting to address. So that is the final equity criteria that I wanted to make sure folks were able to wrap their heads around and respond to if they'd like.
Thank you, Ms. Beard. Committee members, comments, questions? Councilmember Chambliss.
Yeah, maybe I wasn't listening well. With this diagram, is the left side, is the right side a revision of the left side, or is this across the spectrum of racially diverse communities? At least one projected partner, is at least one projected partner racially representative? And that's in a racially diverse community. For the racially homogenous communities, then you're looking at any underrepresented communities in the project area. Is that the way this diagram is interpreted?
Okay. Councilmember Chambliss, I think that's accurate. Yeah, that's how I'm intending it.
Anything else, Councilmember Chambliss?
Well, so these are examples, and it is a diagram. I don't think it's just cut and dry, so I don't think we should look at it necessarily like that. You could have a racially homogenous community and still make sure that there's at least one project partner, you know, racially representative, that's addressing the racially unrepresented community, and vice versa. So that's also another way to look at this, if that makes any sense.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion on this, Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Okay, so the unintended consequences. I mean, again, I've been part of the discussions, but I want to make sure. So racially homogenous communities, any race, so all white, all black, all Latinx. I mean, I just, I think I'm just trying to make sure that what we're saying is we are trying to, the underrepresented communities that we're trying to bring forward equity and end racial discrimination and close gaps. But dominant white community can be either one of these two. So I'm just trying to make sure we're very clear on who we're talking about. Because I'm just the devil's advocate here, so I'm dangerous when I do this. But if we have a community that is largely minority, black, whatever, right? And a project is coming in that would serve an underrepresented community, which would be non-black. Do you know what I'm saying? I mean, I just want to make sure I'm understanding what communities are coming into what other communities here. And I'm sure maybe that's more into the details and I have forgotten them. So my apologies, Tara. But I mean, I'm just trying to understand what this is directing and that it's very clear. And, the other thing is I'm not disagreeing. This is good work. I rely on other council members to guide me on this too. But, my other job is a daytime job in housing. So those disparities are real. They're big. They're bad. They need major transformational attention in our region in bold. But, you know, it was funny too, because I went to the Twin Cities interleadership city thing that the chambers put on, and I attended the Camden Town breakout. And it was interesting to hear the local leaders who are Black residents, and they were talking about how they're actually trying to get people who are from the community that have been dispersed to come back to community and thrive in the community, and there's a point of pride in that. So I just want to also be very intentional about, you know, making sure that people have choice, but it's because of economic power and wealth building and all of the other tools you need to just make every decision you want for your own life. And this is just one aspect of it, that people, that's the housing choice, right? But I mean, through power, through moving forward, and that's what I'm trying to understand here too, is how this shows up in that area, so that, you know, we're trying to address all of this, but the underlying measure that we're trying to correct are the disparities that allow people the financial freedom to do the things that they want to do, right? So how does all of that support that? That's a lot. I'm sorry.
No.
But,
Thank you,
know.
Councilmember. Ms. Beard, care to comment?
Sure. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Councilmember Johnson, that's fantastic feedback. I really appreciate it. And it allows me to clarify the intention. So the intention here is to say that unless you are a dominantly white community, right? And we have suburban communities in the metro that are upwards of 97% white. You know, if you, as long as you aren't one of those communities, you know, we need to see that you made an attempt to bring folks of color to the table, and that there is some representation of those least represented and most impacted, which even if there aren't a huge share of people of color in your community, are certainly there and certainly could be brought into the project process, right? Are certainly in the metro amongst the consultants and the developers that, you know, can work in the community. But and then the other spectrum being, if you are one of these communities that's, you know, 90%, upwards of 90% white, it is allowing and recognizing that currently our development community, our project partners, especially those of color, which there aren't enough of, but are often working in communities of color, which is wonderful, and allowing that predominantly white communities that may not have the same interest from the development community or the partnership community, but can look toward a broader equity goal to sort of address that least represented. But I really welcome this feedback. I don't know that this is the right way to go about that at all. I think the primary intention of this was to say, we don't want to fund projects where you are bringing something that impacts the communities that are least represented and most impacted without having representation on your project team. And that's the core of this criteria and what we're trying to get at. But what we also wanted to respond to was communities telling us, we don't know that we have access to that. We don't know that we have those development partners at our disposal, and we don't know that we can get that, that here. And so, you know, this is responding to very different perspectives from a lot of different communities and looking for kind of a criterion that gets at a spectrum of capacity and ability to address equity and or racial equity. So that's the intent. But this feedback is really, really helpful, and I'm open to you know, a better way of getting at that intent.
But Mr. Chair, if I can follow up, thank you, Tara. And I know that because I've been in the meetings. I think what I'm trying to address, and you've mentioned it, we're talking about dominant white communities. So when we say racially homogenous communities, in my mind, I'm thinking dominant white communities because I've been in all the meetings. I just think we need to be state what we're stating and make sure that that's what we're stating. Because if that's what we mean, I mean, you know, racially homogenous communities can mean a lot of things. So what are we solving for, and how are we saying that we're solving for it? I'm not trying to be problematic here. I'm just trying to be clear. That's all.
Chair, may I comment?
Yeah, please, Councilmember Chambers.
Yeah, I think you know, the presentation is good. Maybe underlining representative on this for future reference would get to what the intent is. in identifying the composition of the communities, and then potentially the purpose of identifying based on racially diverse and racially homogeneous, maybe with a star, and then maybe a description somewhere else that states the reason we're looking at it this way in terms of addressing disparities and racial inequities. And the approach in this particular case, in this particular slide, which is not intended to address everything, but focusing in on representation.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion on this?
Chair, this is Councilmember Muse. Can we also include to language representation, say, multilingual, bicultural, because that's also another form of diversity and inclusion.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Mr. Chair, one more thing.
Yeah, Councilmember Johnson.
Okay, I'm really dangerous because I'm taking notes and thinking very actively right now. This is so good. It's great work, you guys. But to Councilmember Wolf's point earlier, so on the left of the slide, would that mean that could we swap out at least one project partner that could represent perhaps not racially, but also differently abled communities? Is that part of this too, or is this more of an attempt at getting at just the racial disparities and working on that? Or could you be in a neighborhood where you're coming in and your least represented group of people are people with disabilities? So that development would need to have a project partner with somebody from that community who could, can you swap that out, or is this just on the racial equity piece?
Ms. Beard, do you have a response?
And Mr. Chair, Councilmember Johnson, the way it's designed as it is that if you are a racially diverse community, you are kind of going to be looked at through a racial equity lens in terms of the representation of your project team. If you are a predominantly white community, then you could potentially achieve those points by representation from any underrepresented community in the project area that's relevant to the project. So that could be youth, that could be seniors, that could be folks with different abilities. It's inclusive of the broader equity definition. It's simply saying that communities with any kind of sizable share of diverse racial makeup in that community needs to address that in their project project team representation and first, basically.
Thank you. Further discussion on this point? I will note we have 20 minutes left in this phase.
We got to get going.
And so the calendar kind of wasn't working on our side this cycle, and so I don't know, Ms. Beard, I know you have a lot to get through. Right? We're not going to get through it in 20 minutes, and
right.
This feedback is just also good, and I know that's what you're seeking. So just to kind of put that out there, I'm sure you're already thinking of alternative approaches to this call. So Ms. Beard.
Mr. Chair, I appreciate that. Yes, I am. So there is one more slide, next slide, on equity, and I do think we should address it, but I think that we should also allow ourselves to not necessarily come to consensus today, and it maybe is a continued conversation, but I wanted to revisit the idea of establishing a minimum equity-derived score to move on to step 2 in the LCDA and TOD programs. And what staff brought to you on December 21st was a minimum of 10 out of the 16 possible points in step 1 for equity-derived scoring would be required to move forward. And having, thinking about that more and thinking about our favorite term, unintended consequences, and just thinking about, despite our best intentions and a lot of great ideas we have on the LCA team to provide the technical assistance that would be needed to achieve these points, and really hearing from communities that they want to know how to get these points. They don't want it to just be something they're left on their own to figure out what we think we want. We still have to acknowledge we don't know the outcome of creating a minimum equity score. And so the idea of sort of saying we want to stop break for projects that are not addressing equity at all, but it's, got a great huge chunk of affordable housing in an area that doesn't have any or something like that, you know. But if there's been literally no effort to sort of address inequities in the placement or design or outreach parts of the process, do we want to create kind of a minimum bar for that? Recognizing that we've never done that before and we don't know exactly how, you know, it will turn out, I wanted to provide a couple of alternative options to consider for this. So next slide. We could, thank you. The original option was to say there's 16 possible points that are derived from equity in step one, directly derived from equity. 10, a minimum of 10 are necessary to move forward. We could also say an option 2, which includes that, but also gives us just that sort of disclaimer right to reserve the right to consider funding projects that don't meet the minimum equity threshold just here in 2021 to make sure that if we, you know, end up with only 2 projects and we're unable to fund any others because they didn't meet the minimum score, kind of being willing to say, well, maybe there's a problem there in the scoring, or maybe our technical assistants didn't come up to snuff, and just giving us the ability without having to come back and change the scoring criteria allow us to usurp that minimum, but still try to adhere to it. And then option 3 is sort of the other end of the spectrum where we say, look, let's just collect data this year on how many points folks score out of those 16, and how it felt to forward those projects and what it would have looked like if they couldn't have moved forward, and then have this conversation again in consideration of criteria for 2022.
Thank you, Ms. Beard. There's discussion on that point. Councilmember Chambliss.
I'm looking at the option 2, since we clearly know what the original option is, and I'm having an issue with the way that it's written. The council reserves the right to consider funding projects that don't meet the minimum equity threshold. If we don't make it a requirement to meet the equity threshold, I think this gives an out, and it's just kind of causing a weaker foundation in the criteria. So I would not put that in there, and certainly not option 3. So I'm good with the original option and feel very strongly that that's okay. If we have a way to provide an information session to applicants so that they understand, you know, what some options are, or give them, you know, 3 examples of kind of a generic application that did well, I would feel more comfortable with that, because I believe that everybody has an opportunity to meet the minimum standards. Maybe there's something, there's some reasons why they're not aware of how that could be accomplished. This is a competitive process, and it would be just really a shame if we end up with, you know, only 2 projects being able to meet that. That tells me that we should keep our criteria and figure out what's the other problem. You know, it's not just about, you know, giving out funds just for the sake of the fact that we have the money. They should meet the minimum criteria to go to the next step, I think.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion on this point?
Mr. Chair?
I can't. Yes, please, whoever that was.
I'll be fast. I agree with Councilmember Chambliss, but I also have some, you know, open-mindedness to option 2 because of unintended consequences. I mean, I'm sure all of us have looked at projects that were moving forward and finally coming to us for approvals or recommendation to the full council for approval. And we looked at the scoring, and I know I've thought, like, wow, I wonder, you know, what was really going on there. But the process is the process, right? But don't we ultimately always have the right to consider funding projects no matter what? I mean, I think that's inherent in our roles anyway. So I think option 2, we already have what's highlighted. I mean, I could be wrong, but these are all recommendations that flow from a process, but ultimately we can decide what we want. It's not good practice to do that and be out of line all the time, but I just want to make sure that we don't have unintended consequences. But I agree that, you know, there needs to be some, you know, stake in the ground this year. And, you know, if something pops up, I just still believe we always have the right to reserve, you know, funding as need be.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I respectfully disagree with Councilmember Johnson. In the past, we have not allowed projects that don't meet a minimum threshold to get through. And when we've made major changes to the criteria, we have frequently had a hold harmless clause in there, similar to what is in option 2 or even option 3, so as not to have the unintended consequence of zeroing out what would otherwise be good projects because of some wrinkle in the rules. It makes it a lot more transparent and fair to say that we would consider not using that threshold, because in the past, if you didn't meet a threshold, you did not get approved. No matter how much money there was, you did not get approved.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion? Further discussion on this point?
This is Councilmember Muse.
Yeah, please, Councilmember.
I know, I'll be very quick. So my only concern is if we, consider option 2, that folks may get encouraged to propose projects that may not meet minimum, equity standards. So that's really my only fear. So how can we really encourage folks to apply, but also be firm and make sure that we get an equity outcome out of this?
Thank you, Councilmember.
This is Councilmember Chambliss. I have my hand up.
Yeah, please, Councilmember Chambliss.
I'm not sure I understand what Councilmember Muse exactly was saying. So maybe he should clarify, but I think to not have confusion, we should just keep it at the original option. I appreciate being presented with, the other options, but I think we're pretty much all on the same page for the most part in terms of having a minimum score. I mean, I think just having the original option is fine. For the first run of this, we should keep that minimum score. And if we need to evaluate after the first run, then we can do that.
Thank you, Councilmember. And Councilmember Muse, did you want to clarify your earlier remarks, please?
Yeah. Actually, my earlier, point was not that different from Riva. What I'm trying to say was, let's just make sure a way to make sure that we get, we only approve projects that meets, minimum equity threshold. Because with this highlighted yellow, I was just worried if we do that, if we do option 2, we may end up with projects that may not meet, minimum standards. Does that clarify?
It did for me. Did that for you, Riva?
Yes, thank you.
Well, thank you, council members. And I guess here's my 2 cents, Tara, that I think it was Councilmember Johnson that something about a stake in the ground, and I think we do need to make a statement. So for me, option 3 is the sort of deferring a decision that I think we can make this year and still be gathering data, right, on what kind of applications we get. Option 2, I feel like you put the stake in the ground and then pull it back out again or something, and it seems kind of weak sauce, I guess, and that if we were gonna put in some kind of contingency number, that we should be clear about that, and if X amount of, not just say we reserve the right, but if X amount of projects, if we only receive X amount of projects that meet this minimum score, then, it would be sort of a waterfall or something. And I'm not suggesting we do that, but I think the language as it stands in option 2 right now is just it takes the teeth out of any kind of minimum scoring requirement. And I guess if we stay with the original option, we'll learn, right? Can we work with communities and projects so that they can meet the minimum of 10? And if there aren't enough projects that can move on from step 1 to step 2, there are things we can do, right? We can reprogram funds and things like that. And so as these options are laid out before us right now, I would say the original would be where my interest would lie. I'd be most supportive of that. If we were going to go with some kind of escape route, like option 2, that it would need to be specific. It can't just be sort of so open-ended. Thanks. Other discussion from council members?
Mr. Chair, this is Councilmember Wolf.
Yeah, Councilmember Wolf, please.
Thank you. I would just point out that there could be people that get the full 16 points. That's still going to put them ahead in the rankings for funding. My concern is that you could have a great project that has a lot of equity in it that's not racial equity, or that doesn't quite meet the threshold. Maybe they get 9, but it was a great project that we couldn't fund because of having a number minimum in a year when we've never tried this before. But it sounds like the rest of you would rather that project not get funded.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Mr. Chair.
Did someone's hand just go up? I'm sorry.
Judy, thank you.
Yeah, Councilmember.
Councilmember Wolf, I hear you loud and clear. I am struggling. And to your point, I know there's not enough money. Let's acknowledge that, or we could solve all of this. And if there were equity, and we didn't have racist history, we wouldn't be here. But I worry about what Councilmember Wolf is saying, because her intentions are very good. There are going to be good projects out there. I for one, as a housing advocate, worry that good projects that can't get to 30 AMI on projects won't get enough scoring. So anything higher than 30 AMI is going to start missing out on funding, as well, as the focus is really going towards the greatest need. I get it. I just know that, I know Tara and our group has also been trying to make sure that communities across the metro have access to these funds. So, that's why I think what Tara is offering is that we really do try to give other communities the resources they need to be able to compete in these categories. But I hear you, Councilmember Wolf. I do. I guess, the proof will be in the pudding when we see what comes through on the first round and we learn, and nothing is set in stone. But until we get going, we don't know where we'll end up either. So I'm not really saying anything other than I think your point is really well taken, Councilmember Wolf.
Thank you, Councilmember. Further discussion on this point? Councilmember Vento.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, thank you. I do share Councilmember Wolf's concern as well. I don't know what the answer is, but I think it's a very legitimate point. And I just wanted to be on the record as having said that. Thanks.
Mr. Chair, can I offer something?
Please, Ms. Beard.
I thank you so much. This is great discussion, and I really appreciate the spectrum of perspectives. If it's helpful to sort of point out that if we reached a point where we had, this clearly was a staff fail, and we weren't able to get communities to score the maximum 10, and we would end up, not being able to fund a bunch of great projects because we kind of missed the boat on how to measure this or how to support this. We could absolutely amend the fund distribution plan, the scoring criteria mid-year, and make that decision then. It's another administrative step. It's not fun. It's not one that I suggest lightly, but just to say that if folks did, prefer to stick with the original option, that isn't necessarily the end-all be-all. Option 2 was simply to allow some flexibility without needing to amend the distribution plan.
Thank you, Ms. Beard. Councilmember Vento, and then Councilmember Chambliss. Councilmember Vento.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Tara, is there a way for us to kind of, and I don't understand the process well enough to to know the answer to this or to even be able to guess, but is there a way to kind of anticipate if there will be issues prior to actual decisions being made?
Mr. Chair, Councilmember Vento, that's a great question. I mean, it starts up slow and it ramps up fast, right? So we've been working, I mean, we've done lots of scenarios and testing old applications, which is really tough when you're using criteria that didn't exist when those applications came through. And kind of having multiple conversations with communities about these are the things we'd be scoring for in this criteria. Does that resonate with you? Is that something if we helped you think you could do? So, you know, to the degree that we've done our due diligence, the fact that we're presenting this as an option, I think, you know, shows that we think it's attainable. But I also am really well aware of well-intended changes that haven't been truth tested. And so, you know, I kind of share the seeing both sides of this kind of conversation very much. I think that as we start talking to communities and they ask us more questions about what we mean by this criteria, we may have an even better sense. But honestly, the proof won't be in the pudding until we literally get those applications. The deadline is over and we start to do the initial scoring. And that's not too late to change the criteria to reduce the minimum or eliminate the minimum. It's getting tight. It's not, you know, how we like to do business, but it's not impossible to make the change at that point when we literally know how it's going to, you know, pan out in the scoring.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had my hand up and you said next. Okay, thank you for that clarification, Tara. That really helps me too. And that's exactly what I was wondering. Those two things, one, that you've already kind of, you've done your due diligence and you've tested them against applications that you think should score well or those that you think shouldn't score well. So that's one of the due diligence items. And the fact that once you get the applications in, and you've evaluated them at the new criteria, if it's necessary, then we could address any issues at that time. I'm good with that.
Thank you, Councilmember. We're at time that we have in this space, and this has just been such, it's been valuable to me. I hope, Tara, you feel it's been valuable to you. It's been very rich conversation. And so, I guess I'll leave it to you and Director Barajas to figure out how to continue in this conversation and still stay on our schedule. But I do think it is time we need to adjourn this meeting, correct? So, Director Barajas, do you have a word?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I would just offer that Tara and I will work on a schedule for our upcoming meetings and continue this conversation. And we do need to get to the funding portion as well so that we can put out that notice of funding availability. So we have all the materials ready for you, and thank you for your input today.
Yeah, thank you. So seeing no further business before this committee, we're adjourned. Thank you, everyone.